Good morning on this Sunday, December 15th, and welcome to the Georgia Gang. State lawmakers gather in Athens for the biennial to start laying out their priorities for 2025. Economists say they are predicting a slowdown in the state's economy, but Georgia is expected to fare better than other states. And an in-depth discussion about the problems plaguing Georgia's Department of Corrections. Melita, Phil, Theron, and Brian are all here. The debate and discussion begin right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
State lawmakers met in Athens this week to talk about priorities for the upcoming session. One of Governor Kemp's priorities, relief for Hurricane Helene victims. Theron, I'll start with you this week. I would assume that the governor would not get much opposition to a relief package considering all of the damage to South Georgia and the Augusta area.
Look, the governor is continuing to lead on this issue, and it's still an issue. I mean, we know that there's counties out there that have been going to be long-term affected by this storm damage. And so you saw the private community, the state, the local, many corporations stepped up, but we always praise the women and men who were on the front line, who worked tirelessly for many, many months now. I mean, it's been going on for almost, a few months. And so the governor is definitely leading on this. This is something that will be a part of his legacy, how he responded and build the right coalition to make sure that every citizen in Georgia who was affected by this storm. And when I see the people from GEMA and FEMA going door to door saying, hey, make sure you file your claims, make sure you actually state your damage that happened to you because it's hurricane. That is, to me, a retail sort of grassroots portion of this that helps the governor with his quest.
And Phil, we've got ties to the Augusta area. We just don't want to forget about these folks.
Well, that's right. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I'm not so sure about FEMA and all of the coastal Georgia and various areas. They came in late. But you are right about the first responders. You're right about the fact that it's been a very bipartisan effort with Augusta especially.
Go ahead, Melita.
I was just going to say, and I think as part of this, they may have to change or tweak some of the regulations around farming to account for the fact that not all farming in Georgia is row crops anymore, and that there's a lot of farms that rely on trees such as the pecans, the olives, the blueberries. All
right, Brian, let's talk about one of your favorite subjects, because we've heard about tort reform before from Governor Kemp, but he's back talking about the huge legal hurdles for small business owners. But the Trial Lawyers Association, well, they have a hefty bank account and a lot of power. How likely are we to see some movement on this issue?
Look, Governor Kemp has more political capital than any politician in this state, and he is very sparing in his use of it, and he's only got 2 sessions left. So if you're not going to spend it, it's not going to get spent. He has gone there this week to talk to legislators and said, I'm going to put my shoulder into this. This is my priority. This is what I want to get done. The singularity of that will help push this along. There probably will not be a complete overhaul, but there will be some incremental change, but hopefully incremental change that is significant and will save Georgia businesses, many of which can no longer afford their insurance. Too many businesses and insurers are worried about jackpot juries in Georgia. We are an outlier in the country as far as how much money gets awarded in these court cases. And it is hurting small businesses. It is hurting big businesses. It is hurting our tax base. And this is something we've got to see some progress on this year. I think you're going to start seeing some narratives, the way that the trial attorneys do with their plaintiffs. You're going to start seeing narratives from businesses about how they have been paying out awards where they're not negligent, and that's going to be very powerful.
And you had an example in your Georgia Trend magazine.
I did. Well, Emmanuel's Tavern right here in Atlanta, a patron went out and confronted a burglar breaking into cars. The burglar shot him, and Emmanuel's had to pay out a huge sum to the surviving family. It's a tragic story. The guy was a hero trying to do good, but Manuel's was not negligent. They didn't tell him to go confront the burglar, and they did not have a lack of security around the restaurant. That's just not fair. We can't see businesses as endless pockets.
Melita.
Well, you almost should subtitle this legislation the Lobbyist and Expensive Restaurant Appreciation Act, because both sides of this issue are going to spend tremendous amounts of money whining and dining legislators from both sides of the aisle. The other thing is that I think what we've seen nationally with the reaction to the shooting of the insurance company executive in New York City, that's the same sort of underground sentiment that these jackpot jury awards end up expressing with the dissatisfaction about income inequity and high salaries paid to corporate executives and some of the other things. These jury awards are the symptom of a deeper problem.
All right, we'll be watching. Well, Chancellor Sonny Perdue also spoke at the biennial. He says out-of-state applications are way up. Now, the reason? The way the university system handled the pro-Palestinian protesters, according to the chancellor. He says that clampdown on protests has caught national attention. That doesn't bode well for my junior, Brian, but your thoughts?
That's right. I think the university system did a great job handling those protests. It was a national model. I think everyone agrees that criminal behavior is not going to be allowed on campus in the name of free speech. And I'm all for free speech, but there is a limit to what you can do on public territory. I don't think that's why the applications went up. I don't necessarily agree with that analysis. I think it's because we have an excellent university system that people want to come to. People want to be at the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech, and that has lifted the boats of all the other schools in the system too.
Theron?
It seemed just like yesterday, we were on this show, Lori, talking about how Emory University handled their protesters, right? And how the University of Georgia handled their protesters. And many people came out, including myself, and said, hey, that is not the Atlanta way. Well, we saw Morehouse College. It was all these talks about this massive protest. All these students were going to walk out. Shout out to Morehouse College president for saying, hey, if you walk out of this graduation, we'll end it, right? But I agree with Brian. That is not the sole reason why we've seen out-of-state applications go up. And it's very hard for me on this show to disagree with a chancellor and also a former governor. It is one of the many reasons why. And then lastly, I know we want to give some other time to the other panelists, but let's make sure we're doing everything we can to protect these in-state students. That is what I want to hear more of. How are we recruiting more people to stay in Georgia to pursue higher education?
Phil?
Well, the mission of the university system of Georgia and all its 26 colleges and universities is educate Georgians first. So there are a cap on the transfers if that makes you feel a little better, Lori. But also, yeah, in fact, some of these radicals, they were up on their probation. They violated the law. They were trying to put up encampments at the University of Georgia. Yes, it was a crackdown that went nationwide. It was necessary, and they're still banned from the campus. That's the way you hurt these radicals that try to disrupt things. And so, and again, to the point of my colleagues, it is a great university system. It's not perfect, but you got a good still, even though they raised tuition, which I was opposed to, and I hope they don't do it again, you're still getting a good bang for your buck.
Yeah, Melita, the University of Georgia is not lifting up on the student organization involved in the protest that turned violent earlier this year. Students for Justice in Palestine was initially suspended in April after a protest, there you see it on your screen, that led to more than a dozen arrests. The group's suspension has now been extended through the spring of 2026, and the group will remain on probation, as Phil mentioned, until 2029. They're not messing around here.
No, they're not, and that news was reported by the Red and Black even as the biennial was concluding in Athens. And if you look at the applications which came in, there actually are more applications from out-of-state students than from in-state students for next year's class. Yeah. But I think there are also studies that show when schools have national championship football teams, it increases the number of applications from out-of-state and other places. And that also is reflected in giving to the universities, not just necessarily the athletic programs. So there are a lot of factors at play. And it was interesting to me that Chancellor Perdue made some comment about maybe these out-of-state students will come here and find a cute co-ed and decide to stay. But the print versions of his quote didn't put that cute co-ed part.
Well, we will leave it there.
Is that so wrong?
There are very pretty people in Georgia.
I don't know if we should be saying that.
Up next, some economists say Georgia's economy could be slowing. We'll discuss next.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
University of Georgia economists are looking into their crystal ball for 2025 and seeing a possible slowing Georgia economy. Now, the good news is the slowdown in Georgia will be smaller than most other states. Brian?
Yeah, Georgia has done better than much of the country over the last few years at a time when we've had really low unemployment. We've had decent economic growth, obviously a huge run up in the stock market. Of course, that's going to slow down at some juncture. Good news for us is that the slowdown isn't going into negative territory. It's just that we're not going to be growing as much. But that is to be expected. And look, our state's leaders have prepared for that rainy day. We have $16 billion in our reserves, so we should be okay. And look, we still have huge workforce needs. So I think one of the top things for the economy is people want to feel secure about employment. I think we'll continue to have that. We'll continue to be strong on our fiscal footing.
All right, Melita?
Well, the other thing that the economist mentioned was the proposed tariffs and what kind of impact they may have on the economy, because there are so many things like we don't grow bananas here in the States, and that'll impact grocery prices. And then it's also going to impact the prices for many, many products because certain parts of the products are produced elsewhere. And then the other thing that the economist mentioned is the proposed deportation of immigrant labor, because that could have a dramatic impact on Georgia's agricultural economy.
All right, moving on to Atlanta's Inspector General is being sued by the city contractor whose name surfaced during a year-long investigation by her office. Now, the vendor's attorney says Inspector General Shannon Manigault has overstepped her boundaries and is not following the law while trying to investigate possible financial connections between vendors and Atlanta officials. Theron, this has been brewing for quite a while.
Well, the vendor that you have there on the screen, his name is Bernie Tokars, and he's been around for a long time, participated in a lot of political activities, supported a lot of mayoral candidates, but he's also doing business with the city. So the issue at hand here is that, as somebody who also represents a lot of folks that do business with the city, is that, you know, are you doing it above board and you're doing it in an ethical way? And I think that what his attorney is saying is that if you're going to go after my client and say that he's violated some city practices and to say that he shouldn't be banned, produce that evidence. However, you know, I come up through an area, Lori, you reported on it, right? I mean, let's not forget, the city of Atlanta is going through a transition. I mean, this mayor, Andre Dickens, is running a very transparent, open government. You know, he's had some challenges and had some things, but he's learned from Bottoms and Reed and Franklin and Campbell and all the folks that came before him, Young, Jackson. And so, but you have to have this Inspector General in place because a lot of people thought that we being a city should have that in place. What the problem is, and Phil may agree with me on this, is that there got to be some guardrails in how she can investigate, who she can investigate, and what information she has at her disposal to investigate people. And so this contractor has gotten his contract renewed. The city council and the mayor's office seem to think that they're going to move forward, but there's been some strong pushback on some other allegations that she's made by the mayor's office and other city officials. And then lastly, at a council meeting, you had groups that support the employees of the city of Atlanta who had some grave concerns about some of the practices from this IG's office.
Phil, is she overstepping her bounds?
Well, I do agree. We do need some guardrails. You're right. I'm in favor of an inspector general. I'm not as happy with the city on its procurement process than you are, apparently. You still have to have a watchdog on that, and there's already some procurement problems, so that has to be looked at. One thing I do not like with regard to this Tokars case, and there's several pieces to it, and you said some, is that the Inspector General violated the Open Records Act. You've heard me on this show. I'm big on that, and you don't violate the law. And some of the things that she's saying is more in the purview of the State Ethics Commission, not her. And so that's where the guardrails would come in.
Okay. Moving on, one more issue when we get to this block. Hundreds of thousands of students in Georgia could be eligible for $6,500 vouchers to pay for private school tuition or homeschooling expenses, far more than many legislators expected under an expansive interpretation of the law by the new agency running the program. The Georgia Education Savings Authority, a body created by the law, wrote rules saying any student in such a school's attendance is eligible even if they don't attend that school. Melita?
So what they're saying is that if you live in the attendance area of, say, a middle school, then your high school students and your elementary school students within that district, which of the school which qualifies, are also eligible for this program. So that means that you could have I think it's almost 1 in 4 students in Georgia could qualify for the program, and that's a lot more than the legislators budgeted for. So what you also have is then if too many students apply for the program, then they have to perhaps do a lottery. And so the critics of this program say that it's a false promise because $6,500 doesn't pay full tuition for a private school. And also other critics say that you're using standardized tests to rank schools, and those standardized tests were not designed for school ranking purposes.
Brian.
I am so thrilled to see this expansive interpretation of this law. I believe that parents are the best deciders of where their kids can go, and that parents who are trapped in failing schools should have options, and that's what this is about. If it's not enough money, let's raise the amount. We're spending over $10,000 in any given district in the state on any individual student. So we're already showing what we think the real cost is. If it exceeds the number of seats that the legislature has funded so far, that tells us a lot, doesn't it? That tells us that there is organic demand amongst Georgians, and we need to hear these parents. They are scared for their kids not having opportunity that every Georgia kid deserves. I am passionate about making sure that if they're trapped, that they have a way out, and that they can go on and build the skill set and get the career they can need to then become great citizens and taxpayers.
Darren, weigh in here on this expansion.
You know, Melita made some really good points, and Brian made some good points, right? And so I would say this, right? If you have the means, which some of us do, to send your kids to a private school, you should have that option. But Melita makes a really good point, and I'll make an additional point to her point, is that we got to make sure that the state legislature is talking about what can we do to improve public schools. And that is something that I think that we got all this surplus money, we got all this funding. What are we doing to make sure that as you give these vouchers and you increase them, I am a huge proponent of public schools being able to operate and have the money that they deserve.
Phil?
Well, the General Assembly, led by the Republicans, is doing a lot for public schools. Let me remind you of that right now. And you know, I love public schools. There's some good ones, there's some bad ones, but I'm also on the side of getting kids out of poor and failing schools. Look at the scores we have seen here in the state of Georgia. And so, yeah, let's put more money in it. You mentioned that surplus, Brian. Let's put that, some of it to good use. But we're not just going to take the public school propaganda line. Again, some good public schools, but we want choice. I think parental choice always polls well. It cuts across all parental and racial groups.
But you have to remember that public schools serve students with special needs who are often not served in a private school environment. And so you have to make sure that those students are served and served well.
Well, it's called choice. You have choices.
Oh, but you know, and I think Brian and I may agree, and I don't want to speak for B-Rob, but like, you know, you're right, Melita. There are some kids who need extra attention, particularly revolving around speech. Mm-hmm. So if I can't afford to send my kid to the Atlanta Speech School, to Melita's point, what are we doing to protect those kids? Mm-hmm. Because they need that extra attention. And that's where the public schools come in, Phil, because these schools are failing because they need more resources. We need to pay our teachers more, and they have to live in those zip codes. They don't have a choice to move. They have to live in those zip codes, so they have to go to that public school that's in the area.
The local school systems are working on this exact problem.
If your kid is dyslexic, but the public schools are not equipped to give that child what it needs to learn to read.
So let's give them more money to be equipped.
We'll leave it there. Coming up, the Georgia Department of Corrections in crisis. We'll discuss after the break.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
The state's largest law enforcement agency is once again under fire for its lack of honesty and transparency. Amid rising scrutiny due to record homicides and escalating criminal activity in its prisons, the Georgia Department of Corrections is accused of taking deception to alarming levels. An AJC investigation uncovered that GDC officials have presented false or misleading information to federal investigators, state lawmakers, and even a federal judge. Brian, when you do a Google search of the Georgia Department of Corrections, it's not pretty.
Our prison system, let's just be very frank, is amongst the least staffed and most dangerous in the entire country. I do not use the word crisis too often because I think it's overused. We are in a crisis. The governor has appointed a outside group to study what's happening. The legislature under Speaker Burns has taken steps to provide some oversight. I think it's absolutely huge. Going into the 2025 session, I think legislators need to make reforms at the Department of Corrections a top priority. we keep talking about the surplus. There's only so much of it to go around, but we have prisons with 1,400 people where at any given time there may be 4 guards on duty. It is nuts. And I'm not normally one to get on board with the Southern Poverty Law Center on too many things, right? They're not my people. They're not my people. But in this particular case, it is a crisis, and the healthcare vendor that the corrections department had to quit the contract because they were $40 million in the hole because of the rate of violence within the prisons.
It's horrifying and it's inhumane.
It is.
It is horrific. It is deplorable. These are the words that we need to use, additionally to your point of calling it a crisis. Lori, you know this. I wrote about this in Georgia Trend. Brian and I have a column, and I don't think there's enough outrage from not just our elected officials, but there are so many families that have loved ones that are in these prison systems who are serving their time. You know, I had a family, my uncle, who served over 30 years in a prison system, and he still tells me how horrifying it was. And remind the citizens of Georgia, prison is not somewhere where someone goes to die. They go to serve their time, women or men, and they come out for a second chance at life. It's supposed to be rehabilitation. And so I agree that we talk about surplus. Well, put your money where your mouth is, state leadership. If you really want to do something about a crisis in Georgia where you're focusing on all these other things about transgender, and that's the top priority. We didn't talk about that. They want to come back and talk about transgender youth and transgender families. This, to me, needs to be at the top of the list, along with Medicaid expansion, along with this gun issue that we have in our country and in our state. And I keep saying it, Lori, there are women and men out there, parents who are still scared to send their kids to school. I think that there are families right now that do not deserve to have their loved ones treated the way they're being treated in these Georgia correction facilities.
Bill, I want to stay on this topic because it's an important one.
Well, you were doing pretty good until you got on the trans propaganda thing. That has nothing to do with it.
All
We have to
propaganda all
address.
day,
We
yeah.
have to address that surely, but we can do more than one thing. I've been on this show, I think, for 12 years. I went back. I was calling it a crisis, Brian, back 12 years ago. You've heard me, Lori, talk about this. I have not been happy with the past commissioners, certainly not this one. Transparency, it's not there. Yes, they're in litigation right now. I understand you can't say everything, but they're saying nothing, and I think that's wrong. There needs to be a plan. You've heard me say this. It's the biggest recruitment of gangs in the state of Georgia. It's the biggest recruiter. It's horrible. You had just a couple years ago a warden running a gang operation, a drug operation in a prison. I mean, that shows how bad it's gotten. You've given some other examples here. It's got to be cleaned up, and yeah, I agree. The legislature has to make this a priority.
Melita, so many times we see the only way to clean up an agency like this is with transparency.
Absolutely, and they are not being transparent. And the legislators need to remember what Judge Mark T. Treadwell said about the Department of Corrections. And I'm going to look down at my notes and quote him directly. The court has long passed the point where it can assume that even sworn statements from the defendants are truthful. Now that says something about a whole department when a federal judge calls them out in that way. And I'll give you an example. There were 270 deaths in Georgia prisons so far this year. But the prison system has quit saying how they died. They just, so you have, some of them are suicide, some of them are natural causes. But by not reporting, they're covering up how many of these prisoners die at the hands of their fellow prisoners. Another way of talking about the deaths is that they say deaths have been consistent. Yeah, deaths have been pretty damn consistent since 2020 when they spiked to the highest ever. There's 70 deaths that were due to COVID, but they've remained consistent with that high level ever since.
Well, let's watch it as this legislative session rolls out and see what they do. All right, thanks everybody. Winners and losers are up next.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
Quick shout out to William Brown. He's a devoted fan of the show, and his son Miles Brown is here observing the show, so welcome. He's interested in the film industry, so if any of you all have any contacts, his son is a true go-getter. Brian.
My winners this week, got to start with this. Go Dogs. I bet them dogs. And speaking of the dogs, congratulations to Herschel Walker, another winner who got his diploma finally from the University of Georgia. And on a sad note, an executive at Tyler Perry Studios named Steve Mitch, who was just a wonderful leader for the industry here in Georgia and a cool guy, died in a private plane crash last week, and it is so sad. It is a big loss to the state.
Aaron.
Falcons, we need a win. We got a few games left. We got to get this. Yes, Lori, I'm holding on. Also want to make President Joe Biden a winner. New single-day record for clemency. Over 1,500 people were granted clemency and 71 Georgians. And then lastly, I'm finally glad to hear Burke Jones talk about expanding child tax credits, but give Democrats credit for pushing this for a long time.
Phil.
Obviously, the University of Georgia. But secondly, my winner is Tom Homan. He is President Trump's new border czar. I interviewed him the other day here in Atlanta. He's got a warning for Atlanta. This city is targeted because of the gang problem. He's going to get the most violent ones. Athens, Clark County, watch out. He's going to get you.
Melita.
Two winners are both wonderful women. The Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor, who will be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and the highly respected longtime AJC education reporter Maureen Downey, who was honored by the School Boards and School Superintendents Association.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.